This is LS, and you're on Thorin's YouTube channel, so cut the Western shit.
Griffin's domination of the LCK has overshadowed the sea change which has taken place across the entire league practically. Remember, the LCK and its predecessor OGN champions are considered the best competition in the entire global system of League of Legends. Possibly the hardest to win when you consider you're playing only other elite Korean teams. In fact, if you look actually at the run that the Samsung slash KSV slash Gen.G, when they rebranded a bunch of times, when you look at the runs that they had domestically, I think they only won something ridiculous like one playoff series ever in the LCK with that core. And yet obviously they went to 3 world championships, they were in 2 finals, and they won a world title, but they were never close to winning the LCK title, implying, with a very small sample size, that it's harder to win LCK than it is to win Worlds. So in this incredibly competitive league, which still has a number of veteran players, some of the best players of all time, talking about people who would be considered the best in their role, you've even had returning players coming back to Korea, Griffin is dominating. And understandably, as a result, they're drawing all the headlines to themselves. People see what's going on in LCK and they see, oh, SK Telecom isn't the best and some of the other big names are down there, and they focus mainly on Griffin and what Griffin's doing. Because yes, Griffin, the entire time they've been in the LCK, have been a revelation, have been a sensation, have exceeded all expectations you could have for them. When they arrived last summer, they came from this challenger hype that they'd been destroying people there. They easily made their way into the LCK. When they were in the LCK, immediately they proved to be one of the very best teams in the whole league. They were always top 2 in the league. They actually led the split in the summer for 8 of the 10 weeks, only dropping off at the very end and letting KT overtake them very, very narrowly. When they got to the playoffs, they beat Afrika, a team that had been in the finals in the spring split and ended up being a top 3 Korean team all year long. They beat them in 5 games. They got to the final. In their first ever final, these players, they took KT Rolster, an incredibly stacked team full of Hall of Fame players, all the way to a 5th game and narrowly lost the series. Therefore, only just missing out on becoming Royal Roaders, a team of players that have never played in the LCK. Obviously, not all of them as that apply to, but would have won on their first ever time qualifying. Something that would, in theory, be impossible in 2019. That sort of thing tends to happen a lot more, as it did indeed in StarCraft, early on in the game, when a lot of people are newer, or even people with experience only have a few years. This is where we're talking about more than half a decade under the belt of some of these players that you compete against, like some of the KT players, and these guys almost won. Now, what makes that crazy is the Royal Road accomplishment that they almost got, which is, this is a team, Griffin, that has so many rookies, including their best players. The best players in Griffin basically are the least experienced, the people who have no playing time on any top team you've ever seen before in a competition like LCK and nothing internationally whatsoever. So the idea that they've come along and now, yes, they failed to reach Worlds, but that was a very, very narrow 5-game series loss to Gen.G, who famously always went through those amazing gauntlet runs and somehow did get better in those scenarios. I would suggest their playing style actually was favourable for when you're in a high-pressure game where people don't want to make a mistake and cost themselves a chance. That's where they tended to just edge people out. But you look at this team, this split has been even more impressive from the Griffin guys. They are 9-0 in best-of-3 series played. They have won 18 out of 19 games they have played, only losing once ever, even seeming to troll a little bit in some of them. Quite frankly, they're styling on the league. They have some of the best individual players. They have the best team fighting in the league. They tend to get ahead in most games. Even when behind, they battle back. Doesn't matter what the gold lead is for the opposing team. They draft seemingly whatever they want. If you give them the power picks, like the Kaisers, etc., they destroy the game completely. If you don't give them that, they pick bizarre picks and off-meta picks that you wouldn't expect to work, and they make them work anyway because they tend to pick them for the comp. This is a team that, yes, deserves all this attention, all the spotlight, etc., but this success, this domination from Griffin has overshadowed what happened elsewhere in the league, because people might not know if they're not watching the LCK or not watching it closely. It ain't about just Griffin. What's crazy is there's actually 2 teams made up largely of rookies. Yes, Griffin aren't rookies anymore. They're in their second split. But there's a team with rookies now who is the second best team in Korea, and that is Sandbox Gaming, this team that came into the league as Battle Comics. Again, an organisation no one's ever heard of. No one's ever heard of Sandbox, quite frankly. And what's interesting about this team is this is a team that came in with no hype surrounding them or their players, quite frankly. Remember, it was Griffin who succeeded last year and came in with the hype. Coming into this year, it was actually Damwon Gaming that had the hype because of Worlds and having gotten to scrim some of the Westerners who gave them shout-outs. Nobody was saying anything generally about Sandbox Gaming. And yet this is another team that is mainly rookies, mainly inexperienced, unknown players. Basically, you look at their team and they actually barely have any players where when you look at them, you think like, oh, these are people who actually have had any experience. I mean, they've basically got Ghost from BBQ, and that's it, right? What else do they have at this point in time? Pretty much nothing, right? Nothing you could ever look at and say, oh yeah, I know that team would be really strong if they get in there. Oh, of course they could do something. No, the rest of them are basically rookies, and yet they're shining as well. They won 7 out of 9 best of 3s. They won 16 games and lost 7. They beat an SK Telecom along the way, what looks like an all-star team. In theory, you've picked some of the best players in every role, and they've beaten those guys in a best of 3. This is a team that looks like it can not only contend for the LCK title, though they're going to have a hard time because Griffin looks impossibly dominant, but they also are a team that actually is one of the few teams that have gone head-to-head with Griffin. And they're also a team that look like if you put them internationally, they would do damage. They would be really strong against some of the international teams. Experience, or rather inexperience, notwithstanding that is. But here's the thing, it goes beyond that. Now you go down to the 4th position in the LCK, is also a team that shouldn't be there. You don't expect to be there. You look at the team on paper and you're like, they shouldn't be ahead of, the Defts of the world, Matter, Score, Smeb, these incredible players that have dominated domestically in the LCK and abroad whenever they play there and internationally. So you look at this team, Hana Life Esports is the team in 4th place. This is the team where the core of them were known as the Rocks Tigers previously, but now they got this new sponsor. Now the interesting detail about this team is the most famous name involved with the organisation, and the name actually who I think sets the tone for this project's success, is the coach. It is On Air, the head coach, who was famously, in case people are not aware, if you go back in time to 2012 and 2013, when you had the MiG teams, and then they changed to Azubu, and then eventually obviously changed to CJ Entus. Well, while they were MiG and while they were Azubu, there was a guy called On Air who was their head coach. He's the guy who came up with the sister team concept, and he's the guy who actually helped coach these teams up in the early days. This is before you had strategic coaches largely. And obviously they were some of the most successful teams we ever saw then. Years and years later, he comes along, he takes on this project, obviously a very experienced individual. And what he did was he decided, first of all, to go with a 10-man roster concept. But when you have a team like Hanwha, you're not going to be able to get deft. You're not going to be able to get these either super rookies or the best current talents. So instead, you're kind of dealing with people that have been rejected elsewhere. And he has taken bad or rejected players and he's made them into a team that is in the 4th place in the LCK. That's ahead of many, many more talented lineups on paper. And sure, they started with a 10-man roster concept. They've now largely just settled upon the same 5 or 6 players, and then mainly playing them. So the 10-man roster concept was just good initially to find out who you were going to use. But you look at the names in this team. Okay, they've got Tal as their top laner, the guy who everyone ripped on all last year when he's in SK Telecom. They have Bono from BBQ Olivers. Wasn't a guy people were touting as someone who's going to be an ex-top player. They have Lava, who used to be in Rocks. They have Sangyu and Key, who are also Rocks players. Okay, Sangyu's at least been a decent enough player. Key's been all right at times. They have Tempt, who was in BBQ, also with Bono. Again, these weren't players anyone was saying to like the KT Rollsters, the Kingzones, the Gen.Gs, when they're re-upping with players. You got to get this guy. He's like so good on this bad team, like people did with Teddy and other such names. So the idea that this lineup actually doesn't even look like it has some of the best players. I still don't think these are some of the best players in Korea, but it's working. The cohesion's there, and they're winning games against all odds, and they're 4th place in the LCK. They've won 5 out of 8 best of 3 series they've played. They've won 10 games. They've lost 7. They've beaten every single team in the league except Griffin, Sandbox, and SK Telecom. Number 1, number 2, number 3 in the LCK. Now, those are just teams that are in the top positions. You still have to mention the aforementioned Damwon Gaming, this team that had all this hype after Worlds, despite not playing at Worlds, despite never having played in the LCK. And that's because when teams made it to the semi-finals of Worlds and they wanted to get scrims, well, obviously you can only scrim either the teams on the other side of the bracket or, well, that's it, isn't it? You can only scrim then, or you can scrim local Korean teams who are still playing, who want to get practice in, who want to play against better squads. Because obviously everyone else who's out of Worlds doesn't give a fuck anymore. They're gone. So what happened was these teams, Cloud9, Fnatic, they were scrimming against Damwon. And obviously when they see Damwon's players, they think, well, these are nobody's. Like, do these scrims for good practice. And they were getting stomped. They were getting their heads smashed in. They were seeing some crazy games from them. They were like, who the fuck are these guys? But what's crazy is, Damwon have come in, and you would think with Griffin being so good, it should be Griffin and Damwon that would be taking over the league if some new teams were going to, right? Not Sandbox and Hana Life Esports. So what's crazy is, Damwon actually haven't even turned out to be close to one of the strongest teams, but they're still above a number of the other teams that contain all the legends. So what's interesting about them for me is, whereas Hanwha has actually been a good team, but without the really strong players, Damwon has been a pretty flawed team, but with some strong players. Like, most notably, Naguri, the top laner, has been very strong. They've actually just signed Flame to be a backup / compete for that position. Canyon, the jungler, very, very aggressive. Hard to know quite yet, he's a jungler, as to whether or not he's going to turn to be a very legit player, but he's definitely done some crazy things in this team. Obviously, certain games have seen Showmaker, the mid laner, pop off and impressed people. That's why people were talking about him and Chovy from Griffin as like these new sensations at the mid lane, giving the likes of Faker and BDD real competition there. Then you look, this is another team that's full of rookies and unknowns, except basically Nuclear, who you might remember a long time ago from Svenu in LCK, who's a bad team. Or you might remember when he played in H2K when they were a playoff team in Season 7, and he was a guy who was among the lineup then. Actually, wait, so was that Season 6 something? No, it's Season 7, that's right. Now, the reason why it's so notable that this is a revolution is because not only have some of those teams gone to the very top, and now they must be considered among the best in the world, but the established teams are all struggling. Except for SK Telecom, who in the context of making an all-star lineup are somewhat struggling, but aren't in as much as they're still a very good team, and they're going to be in position to contend for the title, and they're going to be a playoff team. The established teams outside of that are really struggling. So you go with Afrika Freaks, a team that last year was top 3 the whole year long, was one of the only teams that could stand up to Kingzone and Dragonix. One of the only teams that also could go against the Griffins and the KTs of the world. They're in 7th place right now. They've only won 3 series, and their roster is a clusterfuck. They are literally having to take Spirit, yes, the jungler who won OGN back in the day with Samsung Blue, and then played obviously with later on World Elite in LPL, and then after that he was obviously on Fnatic in EU. Well, he put this guy on last year's Afrika. Yeah, he was a good player, bit of farm heavy, but, you know, he was a good jungler still. They were obviously a top team. This year, he is literally being moved around the map to all over the place. He's played in the bot lane a bunch of times. He basically just plays based on the champion they want to play, and they seem to be having to do makeshift lineups and comps in each game, as opposed to having a real 5-man lineup and playing it out. Then you've got KT Rolster, the reigning champions of the LCK. Obviously with a new lineup though. They're in 8th place. They've won 2 series, and that's despite the fact, yes, their bot lane scenario has fucked them over a bit. They've got some rookies that play in the bot lane at the moment. Obviously AD carry, they thought they were getting prey and they weren't able to. They couldn't secure a really good AD carry player. But you would think there are rookies that come in the LCK. You see in these other teams, there are subs that you could put in. And with the strength elsewhere on the map, it's inconceivable this team would be in 8th place. Remember, this is a team that on paper had arguably the strongest solo laners in Korea. They have Smeb, legendary top lane. They have BDD, the guy who's won the last few MVPs. Between the two of them over the last 3 years, they've won something like 4 MVPs. And who's their jungler? Oh, just the guy everyone was calling the best jungler in the world last year. And for the last 3 or 4 years, Score, who finally won his first title in LCK last split. And a guy who's been to Worlds finally. A legendary player. Some people would call him the greatest jungler of all time. These are the players they have on the top side of the map. And they aren't winning games. And they aren't even actually as individual players looking that good. Then you've got Gen.G. So this is a team that obviously a couple of years ago won the Worlds. They were Worlds reps last year. They're in 9th place. They've also won 2 series. And this is a team that was supposed to have a mixture of some strong players. So they have Ruler. A lot of people call him one of the best AD carries last year, despite the fact his team was bad. They have Peanut, a guy who can be one of the best players at the jungle position in the LCK. And then they have some solid players as well. They have QV, a guy who's like a kind of hybrid top laner who can absorb pressure and he can play the odd carry, some bruisers. Then you've got obviously Fly, a guy who, despite the fact he's often been sort of downplayed by fans, he certainly brings his own charm and his own skill set, and he can certainly be in a good team. You even saw he was actually a good addition to the Gen.G team last year. So they have solid players here, and they're also struggling. They can't do shit against these new teams, rookies, inexperienced players, nobodies. So the interesting thing for me is people are going to think of this as all to do with Worlds, because Worlds shook the scene up. They think it showed that Korea didn't know how to play the current meta, had a bad read on the meta. Yeah, there's grains of truth to all that, but first of all, Griffin was obviously also very strong already last year before we got to Worlds. In fact, you could say them coming close to winning LCK was already an indictment of where the scene was at that point in time. Meanwhile, the likes of Gen.G, who ended up going to Worlds from the Gauntlet, looked trash all year long. But I actually think, while this does signal a new world, or actually for Koreans, it's one of the few Korean words I know, shinsege is the term they say for that. While this does signal like that's what we're in now, I think coaching has to be considered a factor here. Because Koreans once upon a time were considered world leaders in coaching and hierarchy and infrastructure. But you look at some of the people who've come along now and had impact on these teams that have come up the last couple of years, they aren't the established coaches. They aren't Coma. They aren't the guys from Katie Roster, the guys who were over in Gen.G, etc. Like last year, a lot of it was I Love Uve, the legendary StarCraft bonjour and coach of Africa, who was up with some of their crazy picks and when to bring in different players and how they practiced. Obviously, Griffin, you have to look at CV Max, who seems to have some kind of the impetus behind these crazy drafts they do, and the fact that he's really turned that team loose to, on the one hand, have discipline, but be willing to play very aggressive when they kind of have the opponent under their foot, as it were. And then, as I said before, on air from Hanwha, you look at Hanwha, this looks like the most obvious team where a coach has had an enormous impact on them being able to have success. So going forwards, this looks like an entirely different LCK than we have ever seen before. And at the moment, while yes, SK Telecom is still very good, while sure, Kingzone, funnily enough, of the established teams, not actually a lineup that many people thought was going to be that great, are decent and are starting to look like they could maybe be a team that could potentially do something in the playoffs. They haven't actually yet fully secured themselves a playoff spot. This is not the LCK of your daddy-o. This video and all of the content on my channel is kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, James Harding, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Travis Greb, Tristan Jones, and as always, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to take part in an esports discussion with yours truly? Would you like teasers for some of my upcoming content? See who the guests are going to be. Do you want to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA? Perhaps you'd like to suggest a guest you'd like to see in my content or a topic to discuss. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.